The F-4S is a top-tier premium jet fighter in War Thunder. Is it worth it? Let's find out. When the F-4 Phantom II was originally developed, it was envisioned as a high-speed aircraft that could primarily use air-to-air missiles to defeat enemy fighters and bombers. A growing school of thought at the time thought that the traditional maneuvering dogfight was dead, and placed enormous faith in upcoming beyond visual range weapons and high-powered radar systems. Once the F-4 started fighting in the skies over Vietnam, it quickly became clear that dogfighting wasn't going away, and a series of progressive improvements were made to the F-4 over the years. The F-4J was one such upgrade, and represented a major program for the US Navy and Marine Corps during the latter half of the 1960s. The F-4J had upgraded engines, a new radar set and combat computer, a number of aerodynamic refinements, and expanded weapons compatibility. Meanwhile, the US Air Force had its own F-4 modernization programs, and the Navy liked some of what they saw. This resulted in the F-4S, which was a modified F-4J that not only upgraded the engines, yet again, but strengthened the airframe for higher sustained G-loads, and also incorporated some of the aerodynamic upgrades originally used by the Air Force. The new plane first flew in 1977, and pilots quickly found that the new leading-edge wing slats made a noticeable difference in flight performance, especially in high-speed turns. Examples of the F-4S that entered service were all upgrades of existing F-4J airframes rather than newly built aircraft, and roughly 300 of them were rebuilt under the program. The F-4S was the final version of the Phantom to fly for the US Navy, and they were slowly phased out of service in the late 80s, being replaced by the F-14 Tomcat and the F/A-18 Hornet. What we get in War Thunder is the F-4S. This is a premium fighter in Rank 7 of the American Air Tree with a battle rating of 11.3. This jet gets a fully featured ballistics computer with the CCIP for all of its weapons, the CCRP for its bombs, a helmet-mounted sight, and the enhanced envelope gun sight, which gives an adjusted targeting pip when you have a radar lock on a target. Its radar set is the AN/APG-59. It's got reasonably good range, regular lookup search mode, and a pulse Doppler velocity tracking look-down head-on mode. Plus, multiple range presets on the scope, multiple sweep angles, and the ACM boresight mode. Now, since a lot of people flying the F-4S might be new to top-tier jets, I'm going to use this opportunity for a shameless plug. If you need a refresher on aircraft radar, air-to-air missiles, or air-to-ground weapons, check out the link in the pinned comment on this video for my complete tutorials on all of that stuff. In terms of weapons, this jet doesn't have a built-in gun, but it can take an external gun pod, along with an enormous amount of bombs, rocket pods, and air-to-air missiles. Notably lacking, though, are any guided air-to-ground weapons. The IR missile you get is the AIM-9H. This is a rear aspect missile with pretty good range, 18 Gs of pull, and reasonably good tracking. In practice, this will be your main dogfight weapon in the F-4S. Your long-range weapon is the AIM-7F. This is a semi-active radar missile with 25 Gs of pull, a good-sized warhead, and pretty decent overall performance. In practice, this is best used in between 3 and 15 kilometers, but you can occasionally land longer-range shots against head-on targets. The flight performance of the F-4S places it among the best Phantoms in the game. That said, it's still outclassed by many of its opponents. The majority of the time, this plane gets sucked up into top-tier matches against MiG-29s, Mirage 2000s, and F-16s that can totally run circles around it in a 1v1. Speaking generally, the F-4S is still competitive-ish, but just remember that in a pure turn fight, you can easily get dunked on by 4th-generation fighters. Vertical maneuvers are especially dangerous because despite this jet's upgraded engines, it's still a really heavy fighter and it loses a lot of energy in loops and half loops. And if you try to go up over the top, you're going to end up being incredibly vulnerable while you're just hanging in the air at the crest of a loop. Now, I showed a few examples of vertical maneuvers in the gameplay footage in this review, and watch my airspeed, you'll see what I'm talking about. Also, while this jet is pretty fast, most of the 4th gen stuff is going to end up being faster, both in acceleration and maximum speed. It's also worth mentioning that taking the gun pod, which is almost mandatory, does impact the flight performance a bit, and taking a load out of bombs will dramatically handicap your turning performance until you drop them. Now, it's not all doom and gloom. On its own, the plane does have reasonably good performance, and it is among the best F4 Phantoms in the game. The F-4S has its leading edge slats, which deploy automatically, but you can also throw them out manually using your combat flaps keybind. Plus, its air brake works pretty well and can occasionally help you force somebody into overshooting, though you'll still lose prolonged scissor fights and stuff most of the time. I don't want it to sound like this jet flies bad. It doesn't, and you'll totally go seal clubbing in a down tier. It's just that it usually gets paired by the matchmaker into jets that generally outclass it a little bit. Taking the F-4S out into air battles is generally similar to other upgraded F-4 models, but I want to address the elephant in the room for a moment. A lot of players watching this video are going to be using the F-4S as their first, or one of their first, high-tier jets. If that's you, that's fine, but there's going to be an enormous learning curve in terms of positioning tactics, missile attack vectors, using countermeasures, and air combat maneuvering in this thing, compared to props or even lower-tier jet fighters. I can't possibly go over all of that here. This would be 2 hours long. But I just want to mention, don't get discouraged if you struggle. It just takes a bit of practice. I picked the gameplay footage that I used in this review to try and show a variety of different situations. Some that worked out well, some that didn't, so that you can hopefully get a feel for the jet's overall capabilities. If you haven't seen it yet, you should check out my video on how I make my aircraft reviews. Now, all of that said, many of the other jets are going to outrun you off the runway, so you usually won't be the tip of the spear, and that's probably a good thing. And you'll have your best success in air combat if you look for targets that might be distracted or are otherwise unlikely to suck you into a turn fight. The AIM-7F is a reasonably good weapon for head-ons, but you're going to lose jousting matching fights against MiG-29s and Yak-141s throwing R-27 ERs at you, so try to avoid that. In terms of ground attack, the F-4S actually carries a really good load of bombs for a top-tier jet. If you're using this to grind out the tech tree, taking bombs and doing, a base bombing run before you go into air combat is a totally legit thing to do, no matter what anyone says. But just be ready to ditch your bombs early if you get intercepted, and by the way, that will happen a lot. Now, unfortunately, you don't get any guided air-to-ground weapons, so the F-4S isn't really very well suited for close air support in ground battles. But if you must do close air support with this one, the Zuni rockets are probably going to be your best choice. Visually, this plane looks pretty much like other Phantoms, with only a few minor visual differences. If you like the F-4 generally, you'll like this one. But unfortunately, there aren't any custom paint jobs or anything for it in the game yet, which I thought was kind of weird. The good news is that if you want to spice it up a little, there are tons of great player-made skins on War Thunder Live. Landing the F-4S is reasonably simple for a heavy jet fighter. You can drop gear and landing flaps at around 450 kilometers an hour, which combine with the reasonably good air brakes and a drag chute to simplify final approach and landing a bit. You get an arrestor hook too, even though you really won't get a chance to use it. The cockpit of the F-4S is pretty typical for a Phantom. No rearward visibility, but the instrument placement is generally okay. The HUD is useful, and you get the trademark tinted front panel. If this is your first top-tier jet, flying in VR might be pretty disorienting, but it gets easier once you memorize where the instruments are. To close out on the premium F-4S. This jet carries an enormous load of 8 air-to-air missiles. Its air-to-ground weapons don't replace any of those missiles, but instead add to the loadouts. And it's really one of the most maneuverable and high-performance Phantoms in the game. However, it's outclassed in a dogfight by most of the 4th-gen fighters it faces. Fuel can occasionally be an issue on larger maps if you leave the afterburner on. It doesn't have a built-in gun, and it's very expensive. The final verdict on the F-4S is that this ends up being really an average top-tier jet, but that's mostly just because of what it goes up against, and it can still be an effective grinder if flown well. Less experienced players will run into a pretty steep learning curve, and if you're thinking about picking this up, just remember, it's very expensive. As always, thanks for watching.